our experiences in the Giving for Change program, which is the Power of Voices program that we are part of together with KCDF and Hodgson. So perhaps it's important for me to start off by saying that the Shift the Power movement, it originated in a very far distant corner of the philanthropy and development space. And that was specifically in the field of community philanthropy. And I think it's important to say that a lot of the Shift the Power discourse, as it comes from the sort of Southern civil society side or the demand side of systems change, didn't really start with funders and INGOs. It started around the proposition to do with emergent practice and people, wherever they were in the world, evolving new kinds of models. And we're going to hear from Grace when she speaks about the Kenya Community Development Foundation. But I think it's important to say it didn't start at the center, it started at the edges. So my organization, the Global Fund for Community Foundations, has been supporting the emergence of community philanthropy as a strategy for shifting power, increasing ownership and agency for the last 16 years. And we've built up a network of some 200 organizations in 70 countries, many of whom I would say have stepped outside of the dominant system and have been looking at the role of community proximate and community-based grant makers in getting money to local grassroots groups, so building local ecosystems, and who've been exploring different ways of valuing and measuring assets and valuing the fact that ordinary people in communities have assets, and when they bring them to the table, actually that moves them from being beneficiaries to being co-investors. And I think that's important to say, because actually Shift the Power really kind of came into its own in 2016 at the Global Summit on Community Philanthropy, which was held in Johannesburg. But the background to it really came from the 10 years before that of really building up relationships and building up a conversation around a different way of doing development, which was centered on the importance of trust, on the importance of relationships, on the acknowledgement of local resources and assets, and the fact that none of these things tend to get considered as being important in the mainstream development discourse. So I think in the last couple of years with COVID, with the death of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, the whole decolonialization sort of debates, I think there's been a real shock for the INGO system and the funding system more generally. And I think it has forced a conversation around these different threads to do with what is the role of the international NGO sector in fostering more bottom-up approaches and essentially in shifting power. I think typically there's been a narrative that INGOs are important in fostering global solidarity, and that there's been a sort of a rhetoric around we are one and together, but often that has fallen short at the level of practice on the ground. So the question whether INGOs are enablers or blockers in the system, I think, has really come to the fore in recent years. So I know that many, over the last couple of years, I've spoken to the leaders of many INGOs who've wanted to talk about what they're doing to shift power. And I sort of see two trends. One is shifting power at the level of programs, of policies, of, maybe we need a more representative board, but still rather holding off. This is something that can be done by some policy changes or hiring some different kind of people. And fewer, I would say, who are really embarking on existential questions about the role of INGOs in a joined up system based on solidarity and allyship, where actually the whole purpose is to shift and share power towards partners in the global south. So I wanted to talk about some of the things that I've been seeing. But first I want to say, whenever we convene meetings around Shift the Power, and we've done this quite consistently over the last 3 years, and many of our partners come to these meetings, there's a real appetite, I'd say, in the global south to understand what it means to shift the power from the perspective of a Southern actor. And I think Grace is going to speak about this. But I think it's important for you to know that most of our conversations tend to be less about asking others to shift power and more about reflective practice, about how, if you are a local fund or a foundation, if you have grant making resources, if you're trying to build trust, how you need to look and sound different, how you need to make sure you don't just reinforce power dynamics that exist in the global south, in the global north, and move them to the global south. So there's a real emphasis, not just on the locus of money, but on how development is done. How do people really participate? How do we value contributions? How do we think about governance and participation and structures in ways that really put communities in the driving seat? And so I think that's really important to say, because a lot of our work has really been about emergent practice. It's not just been about a kind of inequitable system, but really about actually how do Southern civil society organizations need to reimagine themselves too, in order to ensure that they are not holding, but they are shifting power. So I wanted just to make a few comments on things I've seen sort of positive and less positive in the last couple of years. But I think the most important thing is this is a new conversation that has started, and the fact that it's on the table is critically important, because I think in the past there was a lot of lip service around the notion of partnership. And I always used to talk about our uppy partners and our downy partners, and our uppy partners are the ones who gave us money, and our downy partners, the ones that we gave money to. And this thing that if one of them calls, automatically the power dynamics of the system mean that you're drawn to those with power over you in order to access resources and stuff. And that partnership doesn't really do it as a word that's very useful in unpacking power dynamics. So I think there's something about practices that we've sort of, as we're talking about the rhetoric of kind of global solidarity and togetherness, some of the practices that just undermine that, things like INGOs fundraising in country and essentially competing with Southern partners, so looking for new funding sources, and rather than helping to kind of build local systems of philanthropy that could resource civil society over the longer term, fundraising for themselves. We published a letter just at the beginning of COVID, which was signed by 200 Southern organizations around the world, saying, this is not okay. Help us to build our own systems of giving. Don't just come in here and undercut us. I think we'd see a lot of things like poaching of staff. So the number of times our partners, who tend to be less well-resourced, they bring in new staff, fantastic, very charismatic people, and then suddenly, they've gone off to another INGO where they get paid better in a more sort of stable environment. So there are practices that directly undermine the notion of partnership in its truest sense. I think similarly, that Southern civil society organizations still live on a starvation cycle, that somehow the memo about building long-term resources and reserves and being in control of one's financial future and legitimately covering overheads and things still hasn't really got through. And so you do see this imbalance about larger organizations in the global north really resourcing themselves fully and their Southern partners not being able to do and living off a project-to-project basis. I think there's an important conversation to be had about if the role of INGOs is different, what is it? And how to avoid reinserting oneself into the narrative to say, no, but we have to be here because ... And sometimes it leads to a slightly parent-child relationship where the INGOs are the parents and they're protecting their children, the Southern partners, saying, no, we will carry the burden because it's too much for our partners. So I really think thinking about, well, if the role is different, does it have to be there? And if so, what is the logic? And do others accept the logic for being there? And I think that's a really difficult existential question, but it's one that nonetheless needs to be had. We saw in the Power of Voices program, in the preparation as people were submitting proposals, we just heard plenty of anecdotes of practices that weren't great. So you buy a ticket to bring someone from Africa to The Hague to talk about a project for some time, and you buy the ticket, but actually that's 2 days of that person's time, and people feeling like they've been extracted from and yet not really fully participating, or people being told that they could be part of this alliance, but if they said they were part of this alliance, they had to promise not to go out with any other alliance too. And I think those are just not okay. And yet if you're in a power down situation, it's very hard to say those practices are not okay. So I think one of the things that's been really interesting over the last year has been the dimension around the notion of allyship. The idea that actually partnership as itself is a neutral term. if we're really going to shift power and reimagine a system, and if we believe, which I do, that we need different configurations, everyone has a role to play. We need different configurations of allies and actors throughout the system, but we need to put power on the table, and we need to understand that allyship is deliberately dismantling power. It's not, rather than just talking about partnership, but not really naming power dynamics. And I think that having that conversation on the table, whether it's from Southern civil society to Northern INGO, or Southern civil society actor to community members, that unless we put that conversation on the table, we are missing a trick. And anything we try to do will not be transformational. It will just be kind of tinkering around at the edges. So I think that the importance and the opportunity of having this as a live conversation in everything we do remains critically important. And just to finish up, I'd say, Giving for Change is the first time we've been involved in a Dutch government partnership. And I think most of our partners, I think it's the same for KCDF, the African Philanthropy Network. And I think it's fair to say that last year we were so busy trying to dot the I's and get everything set up and hire people. And how quickly you realize that you can lose sight of the thing that brought you all there in the first place, because programs create these drivers, these levers of things that need to be done by this day and yesterday. And they automatically start to undermine the very vision of doing things differently. So I think one of the things in year 2 that we're starting to think about much more is how do we act as a consortium where we actually care beyond this program about the outcomes that each partner involved in the program, and we're operating across 8 countries. How do we become vested in each other's futures and actually see ourselves as having relationships, partnerships, allyship beyond this program? How do we see the program as an enabler to lead us forward and to build relationships rather than just a mechanism that gives us bits of money, which will do very nicely for 5 years? And I think that question around how do you really maximize partnerships so that the sum is greater, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So rather than money just being scattered among lots of organizations, we really use resources to carve out space to have these conversations together with each other. We know that government funding dampens creativity, and I think really insisting on carving out the space to be creative and never to be comfortable about our own position in it becomes critically important. Gerrit, I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jenny. You can really notice this comes straight from your heart and from the practice that you've been engaged in. Thanks a lot for this address to each of us. And as a preparation team, together with Grace and Jenny and Esther, we decided to have a few questions in order to just grasp how are we moving within this field of shift to power and transformative change, as Jenny so clearly explained. So, Romy, may I ask you to start the Menti? So we want to do a short Menti. So the question to you is either on your computer or on your smartphone, go to www.menti.com and use the code as is shown on the screen, 48951590. We'll wait a few minutes till everybody is on the Menti, and you can already start filling in the first question if you are on it. You can also find the link in the chat, the link to the Menti. And if there's any question, do not hesitate to use the chat. Romy will be looking at it, Alexander will be looking at it, so we'll address what's being brought forward. Meanwhile, I'll see people starting to answer the first question, which is the partnership I am working in is more transactional or more transformative. And if it's more transformative, you put the high scores. If it's more transactional, you put the low scores. We have an average of 3.4 in the meantime. We'll wait a bit till everybody's on the Menti. Well, I think most people have filled it out because the score remains stable at 3.4. So generally we think, oh, that's a nice picture. Generally, we think we are a bit more transformative. That's positive. I see 6 and 2 really having scores of 4 and 5. Can I ask one of those to just comment on it? Who filled in a 4 or 5? Is there anybody who wants to just comment on the score he or she has given? I can't see all the people, so if you want, just unmute your microphone and come in with your comment. Probably people are still a bit hesitant. Is there somebody with a lower score who feels confident to share with us why the score is low, and probably is there an ambition to change? No input so far. Jenny, what do you think of this score? Is this according to your expectation?
Yeah, I think you asked people on different days how they were feeling that the scores might change, but I think if we could collectively agree to the aspiration of being transformative and nudge ourselves together in that direction, then the program suddenly, the whole purpose of this work suddenly becomes much more exciting and meaningful to me. So, but I understand when one's working in a project, sometimes it can just feel a bit like one's going through the motions of the work. But I would be interested to see whether this feels like an institutional position or a personal position.
Yeah, Jan says, wonder if we dare to say if we are less transformative than we would want to be. Jan, do you have something yourself to say about this?
Yeah, well, I scored a little bit lower on this scale, more realistic on where we are at this moment as an alliance, still focusing a lot of having reports in on time, having clear plans, which is kind of transactional, if you ask me. Well, the idea, of course, everyone would use this partnership to grow as an organization individually is what we want to achieve. So yeah, it's a promise we made, but the actual practice might be more transformative. And I like what Jenny just said, that we also might move on this scale up and down, especially during reporting times. Probably we're very much on the transactional side of things.
Yeah. I also saw Barbara saying it's a promise. Let's keep this promise alive for ourselves. Let's also see it as a challenge to work on. Okay, let's go to the next one, please. So it's about power dynamics and everything that goes with it. Are they openly discussed? So the statement is they are openly discussed. If you agree, it's a high score. If you don't agree, it's a low score. 2.7, 2.6, so it's a bit below average. Jenny, any reflection from you on this score?
It's an awkward conversation, I think. It's a difficult conversation to have. So we have to find ways to have this conversation and understand that everyone has power, but sometimes we only focus on one type of power, and actually maybe some kind of mapping of different kinds of relative power so that we can actually start to see both where it's an asset and where it's a potential blockage. So I just feel like it's a conversation that it's a very human conversation. And sometimes in development work, we prefer to kind of reflect on things that are cerebral, how we're going to solve the problem, how many widgets we're going to buy. Whereas this one actually touches your identity and your position. And I think we need to get better at saying to ourselves, it's okay, it is difficult, and let's have this conversation in a way where we can move forward. So I think there's a sort of a personal skills bit missing in the sector, which makes this a rather threatening kind of a conversation to have.
Yeah, it is, of course, and it's so much related to relations and trust building, etc. I would like to link this to two questions in the chat. Yeah, sorry, she says, I think there's a limit on how transformative an INGO can be, as there are so many partners and stakeholders involved. And Moses Isoba asks, do you get a sense that our Northern INGO counterparts are genuine, sincere, and truthful in the discussion? Jenny, can you respond to that?
Ooh. So I think what I see is, on the one hand, I see good people who are really committed to us, but caught in flawed systems, and that there seems to be blockages along the way, whether it's senior leadership or boards. I don't think boards are very up to speed on this. The logic of boards is that they look out for the organization. The logic of boards is not to transform systems. And so they are innately conservative. So it means, and then that sort of trickles down to senior management. So I think we have to understand that there are some structural issues here, that if we really want to change systems, we've got to change that logic, because development work is not about one organization winning over another. It is about making good societies, people living in dignity and confidence and comfort and all those security kind of things. So I do think we have a blockage there. But I also think we can make excuses by saying, oh, it's just too difficult. And therefore we can't do it. And so you just have a series of reasons why doing things differently is too difficult. My experience is that trying to do it wholesale from the center is too challenging for everybody. It's too threatening. But actually carving out spaces for innovation and experimentation, you know, we've got to find ways where we can actually let this kind of change in through, you know, small windows and doors. And to Moses's question, I think again, it's different. I think different people caught in systems, some are up for it, some say they are, but aren't really. And I think this whole idea of actually, if we get better at thinking like a movement, so if I have a colleague who's sitting in a situation of power in the terms of the organization they are in, but they don't feel empowered, how can others outside that organization help to create the, you know, who are the messengers? What are the arguments? What, you know, how do we start thinking more like a system so that we can support allies? You know, it's the classic thing. Somebody from a Southern organization gets a job for a funder organization. Everyone goes, yay, they've solved it now because they've gone to work there. This person enters this bureaucracy and finds they can't do anything. So actually, how do we sort of exercise allyship throughout to say, what arguments do you need? What data, what evidence, who can we send in? That kind of a thing. So I do think that requires us to think beyond the level of the organization, where the unit of analysis is movements, not organizations.
Yeah, it's a nice way of thinking, to think in terms of movements. Thanks for your comments. And I would like to stimulate everybody to also have a look at the chat, because a lot is being said, which we can't all repeat because of the interest of time, but very useful things are being said in the chat as well. Meanwhile, we go to our next question on the Menti, and that is about the needs and concerns about accountability, make it hard for organizations to truly shift power. Because that's what we often hear. The score goes up to 3.8. Is there one of the participants who would already like to say something about this? If not, I think on the one hand, we see that it's often being mentioned, the compliance, accountability issues, they make it so hard for us. It comes up in every shift of power discussion in the Netherlands. On the other hand, I think we should also challenge ourselves to see what we can do. Where is the space that we can find? Jenny, do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the observation is true. And again, this requires a systemic response. At the moment, the emphasis is on a single kind of accountability, and that is a vertical accountability. If we think that development work is about creating, you know, strengthening participation, people being able to articulate and claim their rights, there is an exquisite and more important type of horizontal accountability. And so at the moment, we only focus on the first and not on the second. And yet, if you have an organization that has got 300 people giving regularly to it, you know, in Zambia or Uganda or somewhere, that to me is a much more powerful type of accountability or it's as powerful a type of accountability as the ability is to kind of pass the audit test of a bilateral funder. So I think the system is only looking at part of the system. So we tilt towards that. Actually, I think the question is, if a bilateral funder has 5 top things it measures, what are the other 5 things that measure that actually would demonstrate a different kind of accountability? And that is the collective task of a movement or a system to bring something else to the table. Because at the moment, we are only focusing on one thing, and that becomes the thing.
Very, very clear. Thanks, Jenny. Let's move to the final question for now. That's also a remark we hear now and then in our organizations in the Netherlands. I do not see my role if power is shifted. Let's hear. Here we see a very big diversity in scores. Is there somebody who disagrees, who dares to speak up? I'm joking, of course, because you don't need to be daring. This is just an open conversation, so feel free to share what you think about it. Is there somebody who would like to bring in why he or she scores what she scores?
Maybe from my end.
Yeah, please.
I scored strongly agree. I do think that lots of the positions we held at headquarters are changing, but I see that as a good thing. So I'm not completely sure if that was the meaning of this question. Like, how do you feel about it? But I think it's a good thing if things are changing.
Very good. Thanks for that input. And I agree, a lot will be changing, but how is it going to change? That's the question. Yeah. Anybody else who wants to come in?
Hello, I can come in.
Please.
Yeah, I wrote strongly disagree, and I hope I understood. I do not see my role if power is shifted. I think, like Jenny is saying, if you look at this as a movement, you an agent. So it's important to understand your power and your positionality and how you work in shaping these shifts, whether internally in the organization, if the organization allows it, or within the system. So being able to identify where your power really lies is what is important. So yeah. So you always have a role to shift power.
Yeah. Okay. So a movement demands each of us to be part of the power that needs to be shifted and the transformation that needs to take place. Thanks, Barbara. Jenny, can I ask you for any final reflection on this last statement?
I think this is such a critical one. I think, as Barbara said, if you think about movements and positionality, and building new chains of people located in different geographies and part of the system and working across that, then that's, to me, that's how you change a system. I do think there is a separate conversation about right sizing. If you look at the number of people employed in international development in the global north, it's a lot of people. I think that framing is also very narrow. I think COVID showed us that actually what mattered when COVID hit was vibrant, resilient communities. So I think a reframing of conversations that could see this being more of a global movement. So ideas that were experimented and innovated, in India or in East Africa or something, actually playing out in the Netherlands or the UK, like more of a mutuality where we're working towards a good society, I think is a framing that actually allows spaces for people to be in different ways. I do think actually this agenda does mean for some people that they will just merely exit, because not everyone is up for this and it's uncertain. And if you're in a job that's raved about certainty and prestige and all of that, then this might not be the thing. But I think we have to kind of be holding this space differently in less hierarchical and more distributed kind of mutuality based ways.
Thanks a lot, Jenny. And I think you have very, very well succeeded in setting the stage for today's session. A broad framework on what transformative change is. Very interesting also that you talk about mutuality. about a movement that we are together working towards a good society, because that is what should bring us together, I think. So thanks very much for your introduction and your reflections. And yeah, we go to the next session, next part of this session, where we make it more practical. How is it being done in practice? And Grace Maingi, Executive Director of KCDF, is going to share some of her experiences in Kenya, how power has shifted from Nairobi to communities. May I ask Grace to take the floor and share her presentation with us?
Great, thank you so much. And thanks, Jenny, for setting the stage. For us as KCDF, just for those who might not know about the Kenya Community Development Foundation, we are both a grant recipient and also a grant maker. So we do receive resources from different funders, be they both corporates, individual givers, as well as other organizations that would give us funding. And we then also make grants to the community level. So looking at KCDF, we are actually celebrating our 25th anniversary this year, and we are celebrating our investing in communities. And we made a deliberate decision in 2019 that our strategy would really focus on shifting the power. If we move to the next slide, that we really made a focus that our strategy that we're currently implementing would be around shifting power to communities. And this is because our whole existence is really about ensuring we have flourishing and resilient communities. And we do this by promoting social justice and sustainable development of communities. So even the premise upon which KCDF was started was really to ensure that there was community-driven development approaches and that there was community philanthropy being grown. So we're in a good position because this is what we were set up to do. But that's not to say that the journey has been easy. So I'll speak to some of the things that Jenny raised in terms of ownership and agency. I'll speak to the different ways of valuing assets and seeing the communities as co-investors in this work, and also around relationship trust and the very important conversation around accountability. So in terms of how KCDF works, if we move to the next slide, in terms of how we work, we ensure that our philosophy is clear internally and with the partners that we work with, that we are really working to ensure that every community we work with, every organization that we work with, we're ensuring that they're flourishing. Can we ensure that the partnership does not leave them worse off, but leaves them in a strengthened position? How can we focus on their resilience? How can we focus on working together? And really, as Jenny said, it's about ensuring we're doing good for society, that we're meaning good, we're working towards development. So it shouldn't be about us. It shouldn't be about KCDF being seen and positioning in ourselves and getting, the accolades or, being recognized through branding, though we do, branding. Let me not make it seem like we don't do branding, but it's more about the communities. It's more about making sure that the communities are really being there to make the decisions. They're holding the decision makers accountable around issues of distribution of resources. So through our various programs, and I'll go into a bit more detail, we ensure that with any partner that is funding the work, be they an individual or a corporate, that we're able to help them see this philosophy and see the importance of really ensuring that they're partnering with us and we partner with the organizations and the communities that we work with, that it's a partnership. It's not a relationship whereby they are giving us resources and we're just a conduit for resources to go to the communities, but we are very clear that we walk alongside the communities that we work in and that they actually do know how to solve the challenges that are there. What we're giving is a helping hand, and they do have their own resources and their abilities to solve those challenges. We're just giving a helping hand to the distress situation or challenges being faced. So if we move to the next slide, you'll see that we focus on ensuring that the partnerships, the networks that we're bringing on board those who are able to give, ensuring that we're giving and working together, that we're really transforming whole communities around issues of education. We're not only working in one particular aspect. We're looking at the entire system of education, from the issue of access to the issue of quality to the issue of accountability around education. So for instance, we don't just issue scholarships, but we're looking at how can we ensure that the communities are being transformed and are transforming the systems that they're living in. When we come to work around livelihoods, looking at how do we ensure that there are diverse livelihood options around the environment, we're looking at ensuring that we're thinking about the future. And a lot of people ask us, well, why are you only in certain thematic areas and not others? We recognize communities are diverse with diverse challenges, diverse hurdles to undertake. But what we are able to extrapolate is where can we make the most difference, and recognizing that it's not only, we're not the only ones in this work, but there are many other actors in this work. So how can we ensure that we're looking at issues of opening doors around philanthropy, growing more local philanthropy, and ensuring that giving is undertaken in a more sustainable manner. So one of the key things that we're looking at is how can we ensure that communities have the ability and the resources to be able to ensure they grow local giving. That is one of the key things that we're looking at, growing local giving and ensuring sustainability. So even when it comes to the grants that we give and the partnerships that we have with the organizations we work with, we ensure that we're looking at their sustainability. And as Jenny said, how do we move away from being in a cycle whereby organizations are left surviving project to project? How do we really holistically look at sustainability? So if we move to the next slide, one of the key things that we focus on as we undertake our work is we don't pretend to say that we know all the solutions or that we know what needs to happen in any particular community for the challenges to be addressed. We are very clear that we have limited knowledge as KCDF. The knowledge and the power of knowledge and experience is at the community level. And therefore, for us, it's very key for there to be co-creation whenever we are looking at programs or projects that we're setting up. And how we do this is through interaction with the partners that we work with, being able to have conversations. What are the challenges being faced? How have these challenges been addressed in the past? What is needed for us to be able to address these challenges now? And through a co-creation process, then as KCDF, we are able then to put together proposals that are able to attract resources to address those community challenges. And at times, we would be able to look at different organizations with their different strengths. We work with NGOs right down to community-based organizations, to self-help groups. And we see our role as being able to collate ideas from across the country into a grant proposal that makes sense to those who have the resources, and are then able to ensure that we're able to have the resources really go to where it matters. And so co-creation for us is very, very key when it comes to shifting the power. The other thing that we're very conscious of is expectations management. Managing the expectations not only of the funders who give us the resources, but also the communities that we work with, the community organizations that we work with, and being able to be very clear and open to critical feedback. So even when we undertake our monitoring visits, we're very clear that we are not only monitoring the partner, but the partner is also monitoring us. So they'll be able to tell us, you don't give us feedback whenever we send you reports. And we, even as the grant maker, we have to be able to acknowledge our faults and where we have challenges. So being able to manage those expectations, because even as we undertake our monitoring visits, we do attend with our grants, with the people who give us grants, our funders, and they also hear very harsh criticism. And they have to be able to understand that we're in partnership, we're in solidarity, how we've been able to take this critical feedback, because we're working for societal good. We're not working for ourselves. We're working to bring impact. The other key thing that we focus on is ensuring that we are, sorry, no, you can still go back to the previous slide. The previous slide is fine, thank you. So making sure that we are allies and not competitors. Being a national foundation in Nairobi, we can come off as competitors with the organizations at the community level, because we are going for the same resources. But we are very clear that we are not competitors, we are allies. And where any of the community partners we work with are able to access resources from a call for proposals, we highly encourage them to apply for those resources. We come in as KCDF when the conditions for the grant are extremely high, and therefore then they require an organization of a certain number of years to receive those resources. So we're very conscious that we can come off as competitors to the partners that we work with, and being able to constantly have those conversations internally. Are we bringing impact? Are we doing good? Are we doing this for ourselves? We have a running joke in the office. We need to work ourselves out of a job as KCDF. We need to do this work in such a way that there's then a point, there's no need for KCDF, because all the community organizations we work with, their community foundations flourishing everywhere, and they're able to access the resources they need to really thrive. So the other thing is that we are open to missteps. As Jenny said, with this work, looking at systems change, looking at bringing on board the conversations around accountability, conversations around ensuring we're really listening to communities. We do make mistakes. It's not that we are perfect. And the photo I have there it tells the story of one of our projects that we had in the coastal part of Kenya. When we co-created this project, we ensured that we listened to the communities and the challenges that they had that were around deforestation. There's a lot of cutting of trees of an indigenous forest in the area. There were high levels of poverty and concerns around climate change and the effects of climate change within the communities. So as we formulated the project, we're looking at restoring the forest cover, and we're looking at also ensuring that we brought on board energy saving mechanisms within the community. So one of the things we put in the project proposal was that we're going to be able to ensure that the community had access to what we call energy saving cooking materials, or rather cooking appliances. And when we formulated this and we got on board one of the large banks in Kenya in terms of a foundation that is funded from a bank, and they liked the project. They said, this is great, this is exactly what we're looking for around environmental conservation and climate change action. So because of the length of time that it takes from writing the proposal, getting it approved, getting the resources, about a year had passed in that process. And when we went to implement the project at the community level, they said, well, yes, we had said that we want the energy saving cooking appliances, but we have a great idea. We have this idea of a slow cooker that is made locally that can be able to keep the food warm. And what the women said is that we prefer this appliance because it can cook food during the day, it can keep food warm well into the night, and even if the husband or the partner comes home, he'll still find the food warm. The children come from school, they'll still find the food warm. So the appliance that is there is made by the women. It conserves the energy of the food that it's cooked, and it's able to keep the food warm for long, but also it cooks the food. So we had already had a proposal that said we're going to have energy saving appliances, and now there's this other innovation from the community. In any different circumstance, this would be almost a disaster where you're like, no, we said we're going to do this. The time has come for us to buy these appliances. You're going to have to use them, and that's the end of the story. But because we recognize that actually there's a better innovation, We had to go back to then the corporation and say, there's a better innovation. What we had said is not going to work. There's something better here. Come and see for yourself. This is what the community is talking to. This is what is going to be more useful. And so being able to make those missteps, being able to acknowledge that things change, as in life, in communities, things change, and being able to be dynamic and flexible. So moving over to my last slide, how do you be able to do this, considering the conditions from back funders, considering the templates to be filled in terms of log frames, the promises that have been made? You have to ensure that you undertake joint programming. Context changes. Being able to trust the partners that you're working with, that they know what they're talking about, that they're able to be trusted, and building that trust, as Jenny has said, making sure that it's a relationship, it's not transactional. Working to ensure that always checking on biases. Internally, as KCDF staff, we're always asking ourselves, what biases are we carrying onto this conversation with the partners we're working with? We've had conversations where we said it makes more sense to have motorbikes than bicycles. And we say, those are the biases we're bringing because we're in Nairobi. We're not being realistic to the context that we're in. We recognize different kinds of resources that communities bring to the table. It's not just financial resources. We have a program where we match grants. And so for every, if I use the context of €1, for every euro that we give, the community raises €1. But it is not, it doesn't have to be hard cash. It can be the services that can be brought onto the table that are costed. It's the social capital that the organization has that we cost. It's also around the materials that will be brought, the time that will be given towards the project. So recognizing that the different resources that are brought to the table. We also ensure that we focus on sustainable models. So one of the key things that I mentioned earlier is ensuring that for all the organizations we work with, we have an opportunity for them to grow their own funding, to grow their endowments. Because if an organization doesn't have its own sources of funding, it's very difficult for it to stand on its own 2 feet at any one time and say, we're going to do this work because it's extremely important to us, with or without funding, external funding. And all that, we crown it on with ensuring that we have equitable principles with everything that we do. So checking our biases at the door, constantly asking ourselves the critical questions of, am I doing this for my sake, or am I doing this for the good of communities? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Grace, for your presentation. Very insightful to learn how you are practicing shift the power in Kenya. And I think we can learn a lot of it, because especially the last slide shows how you bring it into practice, like joint programming, like recognizing resources, taking the context into consideration, equitable principles, sustainable models. So that is how you really put it in practice. And I want to take that as a bridge to our exercise after the break.